Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive?
Always ready to dive in.
Awesome. Well, today we're going way back to the very beginnings of Christianity
Oh, yeah.
with a look at an excerpt from Paul's first letter to his, I guess, student Timothy.
Yeah, kind of a mentor-student relationship going on there.
Yeah, I think they also traveled together and stuff, didn't they?
They did. Paul did a lot of traveling around the Mediterranean, spreading the word and establishing churches, and Timothy often accompanied him on these journeys.
So this is pretty fascinating stuff. It's like getting a behind-the-scenes look at how Christianity was really starting to take root.
Absolutely. It's a glimpse into the challenges and the triumphs of a brand new religious movement trying to find its place in the world.
So before we get too deep, maybe you can give us a little background, like
Yeah.
who exactly were Paul and Timothy, and why is this letter such a big deal for Christians today?
Okay, sure. So Paul, who was originally known as Saul, was kind of a rock star in early Christianity.
Like a first-century rock star, not like,
Exactly. Not like a rock star today, but he was a major figure. He started out persecuting Christians, actually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but then he had this incredible encounter with the risen Jesus on the road to Damascus. It totally changed his life. He went from being a sworn enemy of the faith to becoming one of its most passionate and influential advocates.
Yeah, I've heard about this. It's like a total 180.
It really is. And this letter, which was probably written around 64 AD, shows us Paul in his role as a mentor. He's guiding Timothy, who's leading the church in Ephesus at the time.
So like a spiritual coach sending advice from the road.
Exactly. And his advice covers a lot of ground. But the excerpt we're looking at today really focuses on three key things. One, the problem of false teachings cropping up within the church. Two, Paul's own personal story of transformation. And three, the instructions he gives to Timothy for how to lead this young and vulnerable Christian community.
Okay. There's a lot to unpack there, huh?
There is, yeah.
But let's start with those strange doctrines. I know you mentioned this earlier. It sounds like Paul was pretty fired up about these teachings, like really concerned. What was he so worried about?
Well, you got to remember that at this point, Christianity is rapidly spreading beyond its Jewish roots. And more Gentiles, people who weren't Jewish, are converting to the faith.
Right.
And it created this really interesting dynamic. I mean, how do you integrate these new believers with their own cultural backgrounds into a faith that is so deeply rooted in Jewish tradition?
Yeah, I can see how that could lead to some tension.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the biggest points of contention was the issue of circumcision.
Circumcision.
Yes. You see, under the Mosaic law, the code that governed Jewish life, circumcision was considered absolutely essential.
Right.
But now, with all these Gentile converts coming in, there was a big debate raging about whether this practice was still necessary for Christians.
Wow, so people were actually arguing about circumcision in the early church.
They were. It was a huge issue. Some people, they believed that all these Jewish laws, including circumcision, were still binding for Christians, even the Gentile ones. But Paul, he strongly disagreed. He argued that salvation through faith in Jesus was all that mattered.
It sounds like Paul was really trying to emphasize the universal message of Christianity. Like it's not just for one specific group of people.
Exactly. And he didn't hold back in condemning these teachings that he saw as distractions from the true gospel. He uses strong language, calling them myths and endless genealogies.
Myths. It's almost like he's saying they're getting lost in details that don't really matter. It makes me wonder if we still get caught up in similar distractions today. Like maybe we're chasing status or obsessing over the right way to do things, and we lose sight of the bigger picture,
Yeah, I think that's a really insightful observation. It's definitely something worth thinking about.
It's easy to get sidetracked. But, speaking of getting sidetracked, I think it's time we talk about Paul himself. I mean, this is a guy who describes his former self as a blasphemer, persecutor, and violent aggressor. I mean, it's hard to believe that this is the same person who wrote so much of the New Testament.
I know, right?
So how does someone go from like being a notorious persecutor of Christians to becoming their champion? I mean, how does that even happen?
I think Paul's story is a powerful testament to the idea of a radical change of heart. I mean, as we mentioned earlier, he had this profound experience, this vision of the risen Christ on the road to Damascus, and it completely turned his life upside down.
Yeah. Do we know anything more about that vision? Did he see a bright light or something?
Well, the Bible describes it as a blinding light from heaven. He was knocked to the ground and heard a voice speaking to him.
Wow, that's intense. Yeah.
It was a truly life-altering event. And from that moment on, Paul dedicated his life to spreading the message of Jesus. And what's really striking is his humility, even after all he had accomplished.
Yeah, I think you mentioned this earlier. What was it he wrote?
He said, and this is a direct quote, "Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the foremost."
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, that's coming from someone who really understood the depth of his own past and the power of forgiveness.
Yeah, and it makes you realize that even someone who has done terrible things can find redemption and go on to do amazing things. But let's get back to Timothy now. Leading a brand new religious movement couldn't have been easy, right? Especially in those early days. So what kind of advice does Paul give him for navigating those challenges?
Well, imagine you're in Timothy's shoes.
Okay.
You're responsible for this young, somewhat fragile community, and there are enemies outside and disagreements inside, and everyone is looking to you for guidance and direction.
Yeah, that sounds pretty daunting.
Absolutely. So Paul, he doesn't sugarcoat anything. He tells Timothy to fight the good fight and to wage the good warfare.
Yeah, those are some pretty intense metaphors. So what does that look like in practice? What's he actually telling Timothy to do?
Essentially, Paul is urging Timothy to be strong and courageous in the face of opposition. He's telling him to stand firm in his faith and defend the truth. And to emphasize this point, Paul even calls out some people by name. He mentions Hymenaeus and Alexander, two individuals who were apparently disciplined for straying from the truth. So this wasn't just a theoretical battle for Paul. There were real consequences for those who undermined the faith.
Wow, so Timothy's role was about more than just holding on to his own personal faith. It was about protecting the integrity of the whole community.
Yes, exactly. Paul emphasizes that Timothy needs to hold fast to both faith and a good conscience. And I think that's crucial for leadership. It's about leading by example.
Yeah, leading by example. I mean, it's a lesson that's still relevant today, right?
Yeah.
It's not enough to just talk the talk. You have to walk the walk as well.
Absolutely. And when you step back and look at this letter, it's really a snapshot of early Christianity in all its raw and messy glory. It's full of passion and conviction, and also struggles and disagreements.
Yeah, it makes those early Christians seem much more human, much more relatable. They faced real challenges, just like we do.
They did, and I think that's part of what makes this letter so compelling, even after all these centuries. It speaks to the enduring power of faith and the challenges of leadership, and it raises a lot of questions that are still relevant for us today.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, how does Paul's experience, his radical conversion, his advice to Timothy, how does all of that resonate with the challenges that religious communities face today, or really any community that's trying to define itself and navigate a complex world? What can we learn from these early Christians and their struggles? I think this letter gives us a lot to ponder.
I think so too. A lot to ponder indeed.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone, and thanks, as always, to our expert for sharing your insights. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.
See you then.